Our next step with reading graphs is going to be to describe their general trends, the overall shapes of the graphs. So there are basically three features that we're going to start describing, which is whether or not a graph is increasing, decreasing, or constant. Also, whether or not a graph reaches any kind of maximum values or minimum values. And finally, how quickly the graph is changing, whether it's changing very fast or very slow. So when we're describing these trends of the graph, we're always going to read the graph from left to right, just like we'd read a sentence from left to right. And so if we are reading a graph like the first one here on the left, if we're reading it from left to right along the x-axis, what's happening to the graph as we go from left to right? Well, we see that it's increasing. So this is an example of an increasing graph. Similarly, if we're looking at the next graph over, again reading from left to right, well, what's it doing? It's falling as we go from left to right. So we're going to call this a decreasing graph. Finally, the third is an example of what we call a constant graph. Because it's not going up or down, we say that it's constant because it's holding a constant y value as you read from left to right. Maximums are the highest y values on the graph, and minimums are the lowest y values. But you're going to see that we're not actually very strict about it being the highest or lowest. So let's look at this graph and look for maximums of the graph. So that we see that it starts low and that it increases until the point where it reaches a peak. This peak is a maximum. Then the graph dips down to a bottom and then begins to rise again. Well, at this other point where the graph rises, this is actually another maximum. So even though the y value at one of those points might be a little higher than the other point, they're both maximums in their areas of the graph. So where the graph might rise and fall a few times, whenever you get to a little peak, we call that a maximum. And so even though this one's happening at the end of the graph, the second one, it's still a local maximum. You don't have to use that word local, but it's a maximum in its sort of area. And then we can do the same thing with minimums. So clearly, this part of the graph, because you're dipping down, you're decreasing to the point where you hit the bottom of that little dip. This is a minimum of the graph. But it's not the lowest point. The lowest point is actually over here at the beginning. So similarly, we could consider this point another minimum. And it's the truly lowest point of the graph. But this other second part at the dip is still a relevant minimum. It tells us something, some kind of information about the graph. Finally, the last thing we're going to describe in this lesson is the speed of changes. So how quickly y values climb or fall. So here we see that the NASA budget starting in 1958 skyrocketed until about 1967. So you see it climb very fast. So this is what we could call a fast increase. Increased super quickly while they were racing to the moon. But then what we see is sort of after they get to the moon, that the budget takes another fast decrease. This is a fast decrease. From about 1975 or so, whatever it is at this point, the budget decreases very steadily, but it does so very slowly. It takes a long time to decrease a little bit. So this is what we would call a slow decrease. Now, obviously, fast and slow decreases are going to be relative to a certain graph, but we can use these words within a graph to describe whether a change is happening very sharply or very slowly. So we're going to use our words of trends, maximums and minimums, and speeds to describe the graph below. So let's start with trends. Well, we see that there's an upwards trend very early from about 1992 to 1994. There's this upwards trend. So we could say 1992 to 1994. We could call this a very fast trend upwards. Or I'm going to use the word increase. A fast increase in the number of measles cases in Australia. And then between about 1994 and 1996, there's a very fast decrease when a new measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination was introduced. So from 1994 to 1996, we could call this a fast decrease. And then finally, from 1996 to about 2009, there's a very slow decrease. As the numbers are low, it's hard to get much lower. So that we've talked about now the trends and the speeds of those changes. So the last thing we could talk about are maximums and minimums. We could see that there's a maximum in about 1994, which is, I'll circle it here, this point. This is a max. And we have a local minimum, or I should say we have a minimum in about 1996 when it dips. It's the lowest it's been in quite a while and then rises again. And that's 1996. But we have a really true minimum a couple of times in 2002, 2005, 2007, where the number of measles cases is like basically zero. So we could also say other minimums, or we could call them lowest minimums in 2002, 2005, 2007.